Franklin and then went out to Pennsylvania and Harrisburg to rendezvous with the 11th Pennsylvania Cavalry. There were Missouri infantry regiments that were raised. About half the regiments raised in Missouri fought for the Union. The other half raised in Missouri fought for the Confederacy. This one happened to be a Union raised company that fought for a Missouri infantry. The 12th U.S. Infantry and the 13th U.S. Infantry regiments had offices in Dubuque that raised quite a few men. One Dubuquer actually won the Congressional Medal of Honor for serving in the 13th U.S. Infantry. The 12th U.S. Infantry fought in all the major battles out east, from Appomattox on back to Gettysburg, through Gettysburg down to Antietam, all the way to Bull Run. And they had over 500 men that enlisted and mustered into service here in Dubuque, Iowa, serve in the 12th U.S. Infantry Regiment. One of the interesting statistics, and it's hard to see here, so I'll just read some of these off. This is soldiers' nativity, or where they were born or where they came from. The white bars represent, and this is for the city of Dubuque, this is from a book called Warriors into Workers, which is a study on Dubuque before, during, and after the Civil War and the impact on the Industrial Revolution. And the white bars represent the percentage makeup of citizens of Dubuque. The black bars represent the percentage of makeup going into Dubuque-based regiments. And so there were 6.8% of the soldiers that mustered into Dubuque actually came from Iowa. Only 6.8%. 12.8% came from the broader Midwest. People came across the river from Jamestown in Grant County, Wisconsin, and from Illinois to join Iowa regiments because they wanted to get to war as soon as possible so they didn't miss anything in the early stages of the war. And so they would come into Iowa and sign up in Iowa infantries. 27.4% came from eastern states that entered into Dubuque regiments. There was 5.2% were ex-slaves. 8.4% of the soldiers were of Irish descent. 22.6% were of German descent, and then about 6.5% were of other nationalities but were immigrants. The one thing I want to point out here is you can see for each breakdown, each category, you had the city of Dubuque, and then proportionately that ethnic group gave more to the cause in way of soldiers than actually lived percentage-wise in the city, with the exception of the Irish. The Irish made up about 21% of the city population, yet they only gave about 8% to the war cause. And that's because the Irish very much felt threatened by a freed slave. They felt it as competition for the scarce jobs that existed in the United States. In 1857, the United States went through an economic depression, the Panic of 1857, and jobs were lost throughout the United States, and we were still struggling to regain our economic steam when the Civil War broke out, and the Irish very much felt threatened by the free slave, or the prospect of free slaves moving north and taking their jobs. So they were not too excited about getting into the Civil War and fighting. And this is all about Dubuque and Dubuque County, but as I mentioned in the opening of the presentation, Dubuque County was not the only area that you need to consider when you talk about Dubuque, the tri-state area, and the Civil War. We also have, obviously, Joe Davis County, Illinois, and Galena, as well as Grant County, Wisconsin. And they definitely gave their fair share of men to the Civil War and to the cause in their own state militias as well. This is a list of all the Joe Davis County companies that were raised that contained Joe Davis men, the vast majority of them from the Galena area, but from also other areas around Joe Davis County, including East Dubuque, then known as Dunleith. So you can see all these different regiments that mustered in and the companies. Two of special note here that I'll point out: the 21st Illinois Infantry, Company B and Company H. This is where Ulysses S. Grant first took command of soldiers in the field, was with the 21st Illinois. And he served as a colonel in that unit and went into service along with his Galena counterparts of Company B and Company H, and was quickly promoted thereafter and became a general in the regular U.S. Army. The other one I want to point out is the 45th Illinois Infantry, which had a variety of companies. It was largely Joe Daviess County and Galena boys. They saw a lot of major fighting, heavy fighting throughout the war in the Western Theater. They were critical to the siege of Vicksburg and one of the first regiments to actually breach the Confederate breastworks at Vicksburg. They also had a Congressional Medal of War winner, Henry Taylor, come out of the 45th Illinois as well. Grant County had a lot of soldiers that went into the war. Most notably, the 2nd Wisconsin Infantry, Companies C and I, as well as the 7th Wisconsin Infantry, Companies C, F, and H. These two infantry were part of what is broadly known as the Iron Brigade or the Iron Brigade of the West. They got their name by being the first brigade to cause Stonewall Jackson's brigade to retreat in one of the early battles of Bull Run. And they were given the name of the Iron Brigade of the West. They were critical to saving the Union victory at Gettysburg. They were part of Culp's Hill, part of Seminary Hill, Missionary Ridge, Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg, and part of that fabled Iron Brigade. They lost a lot of men over the course of their service, and probably more men than any other infantry unit raised out of the Tri-County area here. We also have the 50th Wisconsin Infantry, which was headed by Colonel John G. Clark of Lancaster. Mr. Clark's diary, which is at the Lancaster Grant County Historical Society, lays claim to Grant County and Lancaster being the birth of the Republican Party. It is broadly believed Ripon, Wisconsin is. That's what the Republican Party today recognizes as the birthplace of the Republican Party. But in his diary, Colonel Clark talks about a meeting in October or November of 1853 in Lancaster with the editor of the Lancaster Herald. Ripon, Wisconsin did not organize till March of 1854. At both meetings, both organizations decided to call themselves Republicans as they decided to create a brand new party. So there is some debate or some dispute, but also some potential for legitimate claim to the fact that the Republican Party may have actually been born in Lancaster, Wisconsin, and not Ripon, Wisconsin, and it would have been because of John Clark, as well as the editor of the Lancaster Herald, who was a former Whig politician running a Democratic paper in a very Republican county. Regiments and battles that occurred during the Civil War of some of these regiments, we'll just go through and highlight a few of these, and then I want to talk about some very specific soldiers and a little bit more about their stories and not so much about the broader war here. Obviously, the Iowa 1st Infantry we mentioned, and they're fairly famous among Iowa or Dubuque infantries and soldiers that served. They served at Wilson's Creek, one of the very first Union victories in the Civil War. It also had the first general of the Civil War killed in it. Major General Lyon was killed, leading the 1st Iowa Infantry and other regiments on a charge. You also have the 7th Iowa Infantry, which was part of the Hornet's Nest, which was a critical battle at the two-day Battle of Shiloh, in which Iowa boys, primarily from the 2nd, 7th, 12th Iowa Infantries, ended up getting decimated, but holding their ground and saving the Confederate advancement and saving the Confederates from overrunning the Union Army on the first day and beating the Union at Shiloh. Shiloh was the very first major battle of any battle in the Civil War in which the casualties were just literally in the tens of thousands. Lincoln was afraid that there was no way that the war could go on and that he would be impeached because of the number of dead and wounded at the Battle of Shiloh. And it was after Shiloh that the United States started to recognize that this was not going to be a short war, but it was going to be a long, bloody affair. And they really started getting serious about ramping up and fighting these battles to win, not trying to just outlast each other in sieges or those types of things. Some of the other units that we see here, you have the 11th Pennsylvania Cavalry that I mentioned earlier. Company A was Dubuque men. They spent a lot of picket time in Washington, D.C. In 1862 guarding the White House when Jeb Stuart's cavalry was riding around Washington, D.C. and threatening the city. They also ended up at Petersburg and Richmond, and they were also at Appomattox Courthouse when General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The U.S. 12th Infantry, which raised over 500 men out of Dubuque, they saw some major campaigns in the Civil War, the Peninsula Campaign, Second Bull Run. They were at Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, as well as Appomattox Courthouse. So they saw a lot of action throughout the Civil War as part of the Army of the Potomac. So a lot of Dubuquers, although there weren't a lot of Iowa regiments at Gettysburg, there were a lot of Dubuquers at Gettysburg serving in other non-Iowa regiments. So we did have a fairly strong base of Union veterans living in Dubuque for the next 60 years after the war that did remember Gettysburg. You also had the 2nd and 7th Wisconsin Infantry, the Iron Brigade, who served in all the major battles. And in the Civil War, just like most wars, if your regiment becomes battle-hardened, you tend to see more combat and more action in the war because you're battle-hardened than a regiment who's never seen battle. Over 1.5 million Americans served in the Civil War, and probably over half of them never saw a shot fired in anger. So those men who fought in regiments that became battle-hardened early in the war ended up being the regiments that stood up at Gettysburg, at Petersburg, at Appomattox Courthouse, rushed the hills at Vicksburg, those types of things. So if you had some experience in battle, you tended to see all the big battles and had a lot of experience with that. Now this is an enlistment paper that's in the case here and will be on display through July 4th. This is an enlistment paper that's part of my personal collection for Reuben Kenyon. Reuben Kenyon was originally from Ohio, and he was a farmer, and he actually enlisted in the 27th Iowa Infantry at Camp Franklin here in Dubuque, Iowa. So this is his actual enlistment papers in which he went through and signed his information, and then you also had the mustering officers, the surgeon and whatnot, signing your mustering papers as you enrolled into service. You can see here Reuben W. Kincaid signed his enlistment papers with an X. That means Reuben Kenyon, I should say, was illiterate. And could not at least write or sign his own name, so he signed his name with an X in the middle of his written out name that someone else wrote out for him. We also see on this particular document the surgeon of Camp Franklin, a Dubuque doctor by the name of George Stapley, who also signed all the soldiers' enlistment papers as they went through their physicals, as they got mustered into the unit that they were going into. This is just the back declaration part of the recruiting and enlistment papers in which additional lieutenants and mustering officers signed those documents. Here I'd like to bring note to the witness, Lieutenant of the 27th Iowa, Frank Brush. Frank Brush was actually killed in battle later on in the war in 1863 at Pleasant Hill, which was part of the Red River Campaign in northwestern Louisiana. Reuben Kenyon would actually end up dying during the war as well. He did not get killed in battle. He ended up dying of disease in Moscow, Tennessee, around Corinth. in a military hospital. More than likely, he died of cholera because cholera had swept through several regiments, Iowa regiments at the time, and claimed a variety of soldiers' lives. More soldiers, I believe, and I may be mistaken on this, so someone correct me if I'm wrong, but more soldiers died of disease in the war than died in battle. Just because you spent more time in camp in downtime than you did out fighting. Most people were never more than a mile or two away from their home in their lives. Suddenly they were in these great armies with thousands and thousands of people marching all over the United States, and they were exposed to all kinds of diseases they were never exposed to before, from tuberculosis to the measles to smallpox to cholera to a variety of diseases. That really took its toll on soldiers serving in the war. These next two documents, one of which are on display as well here, are discharge papers. These are actually discharge papers for my great-great-grandfather, George Pregler, who was a private in Company G of the 9th Iowa Infantry that mustered into service in 1861 at Camp Union. The first mustering paper is for his first 3-year term of service. He was mustered out at Woodville, Alabama. These were his papers. He immediately re-enlisted for service. He was subsequently then wounded at the Battle of Bentonville, North Carolina, after Lee surrendered to Grant, when William Tecumseh Sherman and Joseph E. Johnston fought their last major battles together. He ended up going to a military hospital in New York City, in which he was discharged in July of 1865 from New York City. And these are his discharge papers from that second term of duty. I also have on display here, and I'll read for you, 2 letters that were written by soldiers entering the 27th Iowa Infantry in 1862 at Camp Franklin. These are actual soldier letters that I've procured, and I'll just read them to you. It's very interesting what they talk about and what they're thinking about, and it's also very interesting in how they speak. It's a lot of fun when you're doing research to have to translate these documents and really understand the style of writing, the terminology and vernacular of the time, and really what they're saying or talking about. Excuse me. The first one, Camp Franklin, Dubuque, Iowa,